So this work was done with my former and current PhD, master, and postdoctoral students, and with Professor Tami Katzir from the Learning Disabilities Department in University of Haifa. The implications of brain plasticity is that different people from different cultures that gain different experiences should have slightly different brains. So the question is, how do they develop to reach this point? So two special things about, or two special properties about Hebrew, or specifically the Hebrew orthography. Can you hear me? So one thing is the two versions of transparency, with points or with diacritic marks, what we call nikud, and without them. So if you learned in elementary school in Israel, you learned with, you recognize it doesn't work either. So the points, the diacritic marks, you know that they help you very much. The script is very transparent. And as a beginner reader, this is very important, but you have to give it up around 3rd grade, and somehow you get along without it. So one question is, how is this somehow? What do you gain in order to be able to read without the points, without the diacritic marks? The second interesting property about the Hebrew orthography, or Hebrew spoken language even, is its morphology, so having roots. Roots is like the lamed mem daled in the word talmid. Roots have both unique sounds, so phonology. They have these 3 sounds, and they also have a specific, usually they have a specific meaning. So the lamed mem daled means something related to learning, and the word talmid, student, is related to learning. So it adds both phonology and semantics, and it could help you read your words. So, still struggling with this. So we have 2 aims for this study, or these 2 studies. The first was to ask what are the neurocognitive changes that enable the shift from reading a transparent script to reading a non-transparent script. And for the second study, we asked how do children rely on these roots, on these morphemes, when they learn to read, and I'll tell you later why this is an interesting question. So for the first aim, for the first study, here we used 8 conditions, 8 types of words. So obviously we had words with and without the points, with and without nikud. This. We had short and long words in terms of the number of consonants. And we had words with and without vowel letters. So aleph, hey, yud, and vav are the vowel letters. They provide some transparency, but they're not as transparent as the points, as the nikud. They're a bit more ambiguous. Yet they are very familiar, because skilled readers are not used to reading with diacritic marks, with nikud, but they are used to reading with vowel letters. So we have both familiarity and transparency playing at different levels. The task was a reading aloud task, and we had both a behavioral and an fMRI study. We had adults, we had dyslexic adults, which I'm not going to talk about today, and we had kids, which was very difficult to recruit in Israel, the healthy children for the scanner. They were 2nd and 5th grade, or for the scanner we had to make with 2nd, 3rd grade versus 5th and 6th grade. And you can see that we don't have many of them. This is due to problems in recruiting. So for the adults, in this first study, we see that familiarity is much more important than transparency. So for example, if we look at regions related to mapping orthography to phonology, so mapping the visual to the sound forms, we see that points, the nikud, increases activation, whereas the vowel letters decrease activation. So vowel letters facilitate versus nikud that increases the load on the mapping between orthography and phonology. Another interesting finding for adults is that we see this reversed word length effect. So shorter words take longer to read if it's in the unpointed, so without nikud. And we think this has to do, and we tested it, it has to do with more competition from orthographic neighborhood, from orthographically similar words. And remember this because we'll come back to this. So how does this develop in, or how do we see it in children? Do they show the same advantage for familiarity versus transparency. So in terms of behavior, we see that both age groups show a benefit of diacritics, which we don't see in adults, so they are still facilitated by having this nikud. And only older kids show this reversed word length effect in unpointed words, suggesting that they are relating on the orthographic pattern more when they are reading unpointed words. In the brain, if we look at the IFG, left IFG opercularis, which is a region associated with phonological segmentation, so one thing, we see a developmental increase in lateralization, left hemisphere lateralization, and we also see an increase in the sensitivity to transparency, but this goes in the opposite direction as compared to adults, so the load is higher on the unpointed words relative to the pointed words. Also interesting, we see in both age groups this reversed word length effect for unpointed words, this time in the brain, and we see it in the visual word form area related to processing orthography. So this is a support for our conclusion or interpretation that this has to do with orthographic competition, and we see it even in the younger group. Okay, I'll skip this. I'll go directly to the second study. The second study, I remind you, we asked, do children rely on morphemes, on these roots, when they read? And if they do they rely on it more to compensate for these unpointed words, for the low transparency? This is an interesting question because in other languages, especially in the European languages, studies have shown that there is an increase in the developmental increase in the reliance on morphemes. But in Hebrew, in spoken language, in very young children, they already show this sensitivity to roots. So our thought was that specifically in Hebrew, we will not see this developmental increase, but we'll see morphological segmentation even in younger children. So in this study, we had, again, pointed and unpointed words, but this time we used words with roots and words without roots. So you cannot break them into root and pattern. These are monomorphemic versus bimorphemic words. When we show these words to adults, again, oral reading task, they do show a morphological effect, but their morphological effect, so one thing is more in unpointed words. So morphological effect in unpointed words, suggesting that they do rely on these roots, maybe, to compensate for the lack of vowel information when we don't have diacritics. Second thing, they show it in frontal areas, left inferior frontal and middle frontal areas that are involved in morphophonological segmentation. So breaking the words down morphologically, but also phonologically to their sounds. What do we see in kids? Both groups show a morphological effect. This is behaviorally. And the morphological effect is actually seen more in pointed words rather than in unpointed words. So this is different from adults. Adults didn't show any differences in behavior, but they showed the effects in the brain in unpointed words. So here the effects are in pointed words. So it's not compensatory. Also in the brain, they show more morphological effects in pointed rather than in unpointed words. So it's not for compensating for the lack of vowels, rather presumably the diacritics or the points help them do this morphological decomposition. Another interesting thing about the kids is that their morphological effects are not in frontal areas, which are presumably a later process, but in temporal areas, anterior temporal areas, related more to semantics, to processing of meaning or morphosemantics, suggesting maybe it's more of a semantic-related, morphosemantic-related process, and it might be also more, perhaps more automatic, rather than this more controlled or frontal effect that we see in adults. So to summarize, children are coping with the challenges of reading Hebrew, but with different mechanisms as compared to adults. With regards to reading the non-transparent script, so these missing vowels, all children, even the younger ones, show greater reliance on the orthographic pattern when they read the non-transparent script. So this happens even in an early age. Whereas in adults, familiarity is more important than transparency. In kids, we still see reliance on the nikud, on the points, and the load for phonological segmentation is higher when we present them words without the nikud, without the points. So there is a developmental progress or process from 2nd to 5th grade, but it's not completed yet. It doesn't look like what it looks like in adults. And how do they cope with the abundance of roots? Whereas adults engage in later frontal morphophonological segmentation processes, and they probably do it to compensate for the non-transparency in the script. Children, even young ones, engage in earlier temporal morphosemantic processes, and they do it especially in the transparent script. So it's a totally different process. Thank you very much.